Hello and welcome back to New Wave History. I'm once again joined by Dr. Akbar Ahmed, and in this episode, we shall look at the history of Muslims in South Asia. South Asia prior to 1947 was also known as the Indian subcontinent, and over the centuries, how Islam and Muslims interacted with the Indian soil and cultures. And let's talk a bit about that. Dr. Ahmed, uh, please start with the overview of the Indian sort of history and the history of Muslims therein.
Well, Raza, I think the encounter between Islam or Muslims and India, the subcontinent, is one of the most interesting in history. The Muslims, as we know, have been arriving in India in the subcontinent for the last 1,000 years, and they've come in two waves. One wave was of warriors, soldiers. Sometimes they were quite harsh, sometimes quite brutal. But alongside that, there were Sufis, scholars, saints, arriving to settle in villages, in towns, and promote a peaceful version of Islam. There were scholars like Amir Khusro, who wrote poems, and in fact, he originated the notion of Qawwali. And his love for India is very, very clear. It's evident in what he wrote. So you had these two waves arriving in India, and the interaction has been so rich, so profound, that you could say that Indian culture today, and by Indian culture, as you point out, we're talking about this vast region of South Asia, which would include Pakistan, Bangladesh, this entire region, and then its effects on neighboring countries like Afghanistan. The effect has been that Muslim civilization has made a great contribution to South Asian culture. You could say in what way? Well, start with the languages. Persian, Urdu, Arabic, these are cultural influences. The dress, the cuisine, the food, the system of administration, the history. As we know that the administration that was created by the Mughals, by Akbar the Great in particular, who laid down the district as a unit of administration of revenue and law and order. And as you yourself being a prominent old boy from the CSP cadre, it was picked up by the British. So the deputy commissioner, in fact, is coming out of the Mughals, who had their own notion of the district at that level of society, which is critical if you are to promote prosperity and stability in the regional area. So the contribution has been great. Now, I find that it's supremely tragic that today that contribution has been not only distorted, but just brushed out of history. So when I read the commentary in India today, apart from some very notable and distinguished exceptions, Muslims are depicted as murderers and rapists and brutes, and constantly depicted in this light. For example, I read about the Mughals. They constantly attacked even Akbar the Great, who used to be considered too secular for many Muslims. He is attacked, and some political party ministers have said he was like Hitler and he was a fascist and so on. And then some of the things that Muslims are accused of, for example, the burning of Nalanda library. You must have heard about this, the library in Bihar, the great library. And the popular version is that it was burnt by the Muslims, by one of the Khilji rulers, and it burned for weeks and weeks because it was so great and there were so many books. Now, I ask myself, what is the evidence for this? Why should a Khilji, a Pathan ruler, and again, Pathans, like the other dynasts in Delhi, had great respect for learning, because that was part of their culture. Why should he burn a library, number one? And number two, we recall Alexandria, the great library at Alexandria, where again Muslims were blamed, and they said Muslims came and they burnt the library, and they quoted Hazrat Umar, and they said, they asked him about the library, and he said, if things are already mentioned in the Quran, then there's no need to have any library or any knowledge, burn it all. Now, the fact of the matter is that Alexandria was burnt 100 years before the coming of Islam. So Muslims couldn't be blamed for things that had happened before they even arrived on the scene. So that is the kind of depiction that is now promoted, and it results in famous slogans in the bazaars where Muslims are sometimes lynched, sometimes burnt alive, their mosques bulldozed or their houses bulldozed. And there's a popular saying in the mob, Ya Kabristan Ya Pakistan, Aurangzeb ki aulad, Ya Kabristan Ya Pakistan, meaning we are taking action against you, negative action, forceful action, because you're descendants of the Mughals. Aurangzeb, of course, became a symbol of something that was brutal, a tyrant, and completely rejecting any faith except Islam. Now, again, we have to go back into history and analyze what was happening, because by the late Mughals, Akbar the Great, of course, established the climax of Mughal rule. He was, as we know, tolerant. He was reaching out. He had regular sessions with Christian priests and rabbis and Hindus and Sikhs, and he was very popular with them. And as a ruler, he also created the concept of a united, centralized India. This is the first time that India recently in modern history had that concept, very successfully imposed by Akbar and backed by his very powerful army and his thousands of elephants with armor on them, which are like modern tanks. Akbar could impose this with his own personal preferences. For example, he wrote to the governors. He wrote to his governors that spend your spare time reading Rumi. Now, what a great suggestion for his governors, because governors often like to go off and hunt or spend their time listening to music or wasting time doing other things. He wants them to read Rumi because that would elevate them. But by the time of his descendants, you have a clear split, and it is symbolized by two of his direct descendants, the two sons of the Emperor Shahjahan. You have Dara Shikoh on the one hand, and Aurangzeb, his brother, his younger brother, on the other hand. Now, Dara Shikoh is the ultimate symbol personifying what you could call interfaith harmony, reaching out to other cultures. So he's very much in touch with Mian Mir, the great saint of Lahore. Mian Mir, as we know, laid the foundation stone for the Golden Temple of the Sikhs. So the Sikhs had a very favorable opinion about Dara Shikoh. Dara Shikoh personally spent time translating the Upanishads, the Hindu texts, the sacred texts, which then went on to Europe, and they were picked up by European philosophers. Schopenhauer, for example, quoted this version of the Upanishads, and that became very popular in Europe, the philosophy coming out of Sanskritic literature. So Dara Shikoh's approach was not that I'm compromising my Islam, but that Islam is broad enough and big enough to incorporate other visions of the divine. And that is why he wrote some incredibly important books, one of them being the seminal Majma' al-Bahrain, the mingling of the oceans. And the two oceans for him are Islam and Sanskritic or Hinduism. So the two oceans which ultimately meet, because both of them are seeking the divine. So ultimately, in his argument, the divine is something that we can share with other people and other religions. It's not incompatible. Now, as opposed to this, we had Aurangzeb, his younger brother. And it's not just a question of ideology and faith. Aurangzeb was a battle-hardened general. He had the troops with him. He was posted in the south, where his troops were constantly in battle with the Shia kingdoms in the south. So the inevitable clash takes place. Aurangzeb defeats his brother. He is then tried for apostasy and executed. Now, Aurangzeb is a contradiction. He's a man who's very pious. He lives on the earnings he makes out of making skull caps and the writing he does. He does not take anything from the royal treasury, although he's by now the emperor of India. And India at that stage is literally 25 to 30% of the world's GDP, one of the richest dynasties or nations in the world. Aurangzeb doesn't fall back like his ancestors and indulge himself. At the same time, it's the same Aurangzeb who has his elder brother killed. He has his daughter Zebun-Nisa imprisoned. He has his father imprisoned, Shahjahan. So Shahjahan is locked up in a very cruel way because there's a small slit in his cell through which he can see the Taj Mahal, which is possibly the most cruel thing you can do to a man with his temperament, an artistic human being who's created this monument to love for Mumtaz Mahal, his wife. And you can only see it literally on standing on his toes and through a slit. And he sends Dara Shikoh's head chopped off, put in a box as a present to his father. And I could only visualize the impact that had on Shahjahan as a father, because he loved his eldest son very much and indulged him. And he fell, it is said he fell over and broke his teeth as he fell. He hit his face against a table. So Aurangzeb is representing a different version of Islam. Now, this argument, which we think ends in with history, as history is relentless, it moves on, it's cruel, it doesn't wait for, as they say, time or tide. But what happens today? The same arguments are then reflected in Indian politics today. So we have Krishna Gopal of the RSS having a seminar, conducting a seminar, all India seminar on Dara Shikoh. And Dara Shikoh is then brought back to life. And as I quoted, the same mobs chanting Aurangzeb ki aulad. So you have the argument that had Dara Shikoh become, he was the rightful heir to Shahjahan, had he become the emperor, maybe the history of South Asia would have been very different. Maybe there would have been more harmony, maybe there would have been more peace. Maybe this hatred that developed between Hindus and Muslims would not have developed. So Muslims in India, the Muslim history of India, has presented us with characters which have an effect on our lives today. And in terms of a stark contrast, two models opposed to each other and yet very legitimate, providing us with something concrete, two paradigms that still exist, I think we'll have nothing more powerful than Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb. Now, I'll divert a little bit, Raza, to mention that I wrote an academic paper, purely academic, not political, pointing out that the same tradition of Dara Shikoh, that is mystic Islam, Sufi Islam, was represented by political leaders like Bhutto, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in Pakistan, where you have the culture of Damadam, Maskalandar, and enjoying listening to Sufi music and creating a rapport with ordinary people, really pointing out that we are all one in the worship and presence of God. And Ziaul Haq represented Orthodox Islam, that only Islam represents faith and the true belief and the true religion. And you saw the clash, and how does it end? It ends by Aurangzeb killing, executing Dara Shikoh, and in this modern case, Ziaul Haq killing and executing Bhutto. Of course, I had written it to explore some ideas, and people immediately interpreted it in very political ways. I hadn't meant that at all. But these models from history allow us to examine ourselves through the prism of something that has ostensibly passed and gone into centuries into the past.
Yes, Dr. Ahmed, I remember your paper. In fact, I read it years and years ago. And that's how I got introduced to your name. I think that was about 30 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. But, we'll talk at length. We'll go separately into that, because that's a really important comparison. And also the figure of Dara Shikoh, in itself holds so many meanings and opens so many doors of possibilities for Muslims in South Asia, including Pakistan. But anyway, moving on, the decline of Mughals, later Mughals, and then gradually East India Company comes in, starts gobbling up territories, expanding its remit, raising big armies, and then ultimately takes over India. And obviously, their policy changes, so Muslims were the earlier rulers. And then when the British took over, formally in 1857, their extreme suspicion of Muslims turned into this mass crackdown, on Mughal families and their progeny, etc., etc. So let's talk a bit about that, leading to the rise of communalism in late 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah, Raza, the low point in Muslim fortunes in India comes with the 1857 War of Independence or the mutiny, whichever way you want to look at it. But it resulted in a devastation for Muslims, to the point where Zafar writes his famous verses, Kitna bad naseeb hai Zafar, do gaz zami bhi na mili. So in Kuche Yaad, so he does not even have a place for burial. It's such a poignant, and he sums up the Muslim dilemma, the plight of the Muslims. And for me, looking at history from a distance, the vantage point of where we are now, and looking back at history, it's a critical point, and I wonder how the story would have ended had not figures like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan emerged at that point in time and done things that today we may be uncomfortable with, because he reached out to the English. He wrote books like The Loyal Mohammedans, he called the Muslim community. He went to England. He literally expressed his admiration of Queen Victoria and the English and so on. But the result was that he calmed down English nerves. And he said, look, we are not all haters of the English. We don't all want to murder you. We don't want to take your blood and throw you out of India. In fact, we have a lot of respect. We are loyal to you. Now, it makes us uncomfortable because we are looking at it as independent people. But at that time, that puts a pause on the persecution of the Muslims. And you'll see a generation and two generations of Muslims who now grow out of the experiment in Aligarh. And Aligarh was a stroke of genius. That's not happening anywhere else in the Muslim world, not in Afghanistan, not in Iran, not even in Indonesia. Here in India, Aligarh becomes almost like a factory, producing a whole generation and another generation of Muslims who are balancing tradition with modernity. So they're saying their prayers, but they're also wearing suits, ties, blazers, reading the Quran Sharif, but also playing cricket. And it's that combination that gives Aligarh this edge. And what does Aligarh produce? It's producing presidents and prime ministers and literally people all over South Asia, not just in India, but what is now Pakistan, what is Bangladesh. So Aligarh is, I think, the point where the Muslim Renaissance begins, because you then connect it with the ideas coming out of Aligarh, or ideas like those produced at Aligarh, and you have an Allama Iqbal and Sir Syed Amir Ali and Quaid-e-Azam, Mr. Jinnah, the whole Pakistan movement, and suddenly you have a Muslim Renaissance taking place. That Muslim Renaissance leads to Pakistan and the creation of Pakistan, which gives it this blank check almost to create these ideas and go with them and flourish and create. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out like that, primarily, I think, because Quaid-e-Azam passed away within a year and he left a vacuum, and we had the first martial law, and we were then down a very slippery slope.
Dr. Ahmed, before we go on to this phase, you talked about the Muslim Renaissance, modern, the espousal of modernity by a particular creed of Muslims in India. There's a very important figure, Syed Ahmad Khan, late 19th century, dies just before the arrival of the 20th century. And for decades, he worked on, Aligarh. He was the founder of Aligarh as well. And his mission and his philosophy of emphasizing education, and if you remember, we talked about the golden age of Islam, and the central pillar there we talked about was ilm, or knowledge, or enlightenment. And I think that is a figure that we really have to also talk about in the Indian context, because if we look at the state of Muslims in India, and for that matter Pakistan, where half the so-called Muslim majority country people are illiterate, literally, and those who are can read or write or write their name are also not properly educated or skilled. So how important is Syed Ahmad Khan's legacy, and what was he saying in that particular moment of colonial sort of heydays?
Raza, figures like Syed Ahmad Khan, figures like those who were supporting and creating not just Aligarh, but Deoband. Remember, Deoband emerges as a college, as a madrasa. Although madrasa today has a negative connotation, but it's a madrasa. I've been to it, and I've talked to the teachers there. And again, you applaud the effort they're putting in just to keep their own tradition alive. And so you had these figures who are aware of trying to maintain their own tradition, as I said, the emphasis on ilm, and within the modern context, knowing the challenges, because 1857, as you pointed out, created a tremendous backlash against Muslims. So everything Muslim became negative, and it had to be suppressed. So these figures, and they created I think, a momentum that spilled over into the creation of Pakistan, into Bangladesh today, where you have a lot of very learned people who still kept this flame of ilm alive. And again, with knowledge, with reading, with understanding, we appreciate that this is something that not only scholars promote, Raza. I was reading a letter that Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, a letter he wrote to his son just before he died. Now, this is very, very illustrative. Here's the first Mughal emperor writing to his son, and it's authentic because he's on his deathbed. And he writes that you must promote your religion through being the religion of love, not through the sword. It's very significant because he says you must respect the temples and the religious people, the sadhus and the mystics of Hinduism. You must respect the cow because that is considered a sacred animal, because Muslims are a minority and this is the land of the Hindus. It is such a sensitive letter, Raza, that I cannot believe that the stereotype image of Babur is that he came and smashed temples and built mosques on them, because he couldn't be doing that and then writing a letter like this to his son. He's saying, look, my son, I'm talking to you as a father to a son. You're going to be ruling this land. These are the principles through which you should rule this land. So again, the notion of ilm, of compassion, the three things we talked about, adal, ilm, and ihsan, are all reflected in his letter. And you asked about Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and there are many, many scholars like this, both in India and Pakistan, going back in the 20th century. Maulana Azad was another great figure, a very learned figure. I'd mentioned Zakir Hussain, who became president of India. Again, you may not know that he was a PhD. So here, these are very scholarly people who are continuing their own traditions and creating a lot of respect around their personal lives and the achievements that they had.
Right. Dr. Ahmed, that brings us to what we were talking earlier about, communal fires, or stoking them as a colonial policy. And obviously, the overriding policy of divide and rule through the 19th century and the early 20th century. I mean, that led to, what many call the separateness between the Muslims and the Hindus. I mean, the two-nation theory, as we call it. I mean, without going into too much detail on the political side, I mean, how would you see that, the two-nation theory? Because it's a very important milestone, and it's still a very contested idea. I mean, there are people within Pakistan and India who hold that this theory did not have much ground, but it became a reality due to the intransigence of the actors, the key actors in the 1940s. And you've done a play on Gandhi versus Jinnah as well, a very famous play that has been screened and staged in many places and multiple times in the US and elsewhere. So tell us a bit about the 1940s or 1930s. What was happening with these two key figures, Gandhi as this icon of Indian nationalism, Jinnah as the leader of the Muslims, and how they grew apart and how they were great men in their own spheres and in their own right. But ultimately, that led to 1947, and 1947 for us Pakistanis is not all too bad. I mean, we actually celebrate that because that was our independence, but it did lead to unprecedented bloodshed, a holocaust of sorts, and it has had huge forbearing and impact on what was to follow in 1947. It's still an unresolved matter. It's still a festering wound. So let's talk a bit about this whole period because you've done a lot of work on that, and then we can conclude our discussion.
Raza, you've expressed it so well that I don't think I can comment on it. You talked about unresolved, you talked about the festering wounds, and you're absolutely right. These are unresolved. I myself, Raza, am a child of partition. August 1947, my father, who was in the British Civil Service, opted. They were asked to opt. You opt for India or you opt for Pakistan. You opted for Pakistan, and we found ourselves in a compartment in a train heading for Karachi through the killing fields of the Punjab. And there was slaughter on both sides. And even as a child, remember, I'm just 4 years old, I still remember the sense of fear that the train stops, there's absolute, complete fear. You could hear a pin drop. And you're told that people may attack this train, they may kill everyone in it. This was happening. Trains were being completely slaughtered, except the engine driver, because people wanted that train to arrive in Delhi or in Karachi with all the passengers dead to make a point that we have killed your people. So it was an eye for an eye, blinding the whole of India. And you're right, it was like a Holocaust. Several million people, I think almost 2 million people were killed and 15 million displaced. So I grew up with that environment. And at the same time, because of the passion my parents had for the figure of Quaid-e-Azam, and because my father was appointed as the DS in charge of the railways in Karachi, which was the capital of Pakistan, he was once a week here to report to Quaid-e-Azam and discuss the troop movements. The Pakistan Army had to be reconstituted or recreated, as it were, created from scratch, and the refugee movements. So we grew up with a sense of awe for this leader, Quaid-e-Azam, who was almost like a Superman. I think someone wrote a book called Moses. They compared him to Moses, who led his people to a promised land, and Quaid-e-Azam led his people. And then in 1947, Pakistan was, of course, the largest Muslim nation on earth. And Pakistan could have done so much with what it had, but it didn't. It became its own worst enemy, starting with 1971 and now messing around with the current situation. So that was the environment within which I grew up. So I had to step back and study what happened, particularly the person of Quaid-e-Azam. And I asked myself, why did a man, because I discarded all this, you hear a lot of the controversy that you mentioned, and people accusing Quaid-e-Azam and calling him a British agent and the agent of Churchill and so on, which frankly speaking is just the product of an overheated imagination of some scholar sitting in his library. But put Quaid-e-Azam in the context of history. He is called, at the turn of the century, the best ambassador between Hindus and Muslims. And who calls him that? The president of the Congress party calls him that, a famous Hindu leader. Other people call him that. Sarojini Naidu, who's the poet and also a leader of the Congress party, she calls him that. And I ask myself, why should the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity suddenly give up that role and then opt for an independent Pakistan? And the answer lies in the 1930s. Several things are happening. Read the Pirpur report, which Quaid-e-Azam commissions in the late 1938, in which the Muslim League is able to document what has been happening to the Muslims, to their culture, to their language, to their capacity to perform their prayers. All that is documented. And that is creating a lot of distrust, a lot of unhappiness among the Muslims. Because they're saying, if this is what is happening to us now, what is going to happen once the British leave and we are going to be stuck with Congress rule? They're not going to spare us. And that's why Quaid-e-Azam made that famous statement. He said, I will not allow British Raj to be followed by Ram Raj. He also began then very consciously to develop a rapport with the Muslim masses, because in the 1920s there was some coolness between him and Allama Iqbal precisely on this point. he was seen as somewhat remote, somewhat isolated, and he just left this subcontinent, went off to London, and said, "That's it, I've had enough of you, all of you," until Allama Iqbal began to persuade him to come back and wrote those famous 8 letters. One letter saying, historic, saying that there's a storm coming to India, and you are the one Muslim who can lead us out of this storm. What an amazing letter. And of course, Muslims arriving there trying to persuade him to come back to India and lead them. And so he comes back in the late 30s. And there you see the transformation. Suddenly from a very secular, anglicized political figure who can't even speak in Urdu, he begins to convert into a figure who very consciously begins to identify with the Muslim cause. So his sherwani, the way he dresses, his karakuli topi, all these are signs for the Muslim masses to see a leader who in their minds is now the equivalent of Gandhi and Nehru, because Mahatma Gandhi, Pandit Nehru are becoming superstars. And now the Muslims had their own superstar. So there's a lot going on at that time. Now, because of the failure of these leaders to come up to some amicable solution of the drive towards independence, you then had the bitterness, the killing, and the consequence, which is what we are stuck with now. The widespread misunderstandings, hatreds, prejudices that you see in India today with mobs lynching Muslims, burning them to death, demolishing their mosques, and of course not restricted to Muslims. You're seeing the Christian temples and churches and Christian communities being killed in East India, Northeast India, Manipur. So it creates an environment, an atmosphere of hatred and prejudice and what you call communal disharmony. This is coming directly out of 1947. This, for us Pakistanis, is a great moment of triumph. Quaid-e-Azam has got his Pakistan, but it's also a moment of reflection, and Quaid-e-Azam reflects. People say he didn't leave us anything, his ideas, because there was no book he wrote. But if you read his speeches, which I have very carefully, there's a lot of material in it. And one theme that runs through his speeches is his sense of conscience for the Muslims of India that have been left behind, because he knows that they will pay the price, they will be held hostage, and therefore he's emphatic that Muslims in Pakistan must particularly look after the minorities, because in turn the Muslim minority in India will be then very vulnerable. It's incredible how much emphasis he pays. And again, with Pakistan politics, that whole period is sort of sidelined, and there's very little mention I see of the Muslims of India who really, in a sense, led the Pakistan movement, and then knowing that they would in the end be discarded and they would find themselves vulnerable to the majority and misunderstood. So today the history has gone so far that I'm not even sure how you can bring the horse that is bolted back into the barn.
That's absolutely true. It's a big conundrum of our times, because so much has happened, and so the events preceding the partition and following the partition of India, and the emergence of two nation states, and how they've weaponized their nationalisms. I think, Dr. Ahmed, this merits another in-depth discussion, because I would also like you to speak at some point, maybe in our next episode, about Gandhi and how much of an ardent, passionate advocate he was for Muslims and their rights, because he, in fact, was killed while he was fasting for the rights of Muslims within India and for the rights of Pakistanis. But I think that's for a later episode. Because
Raza, this is also important, because it saddens me that in India they demonized Quaid-e-Azam, who I must say is a hero of mine. And in Pakistan, they demonize Mahatma Gandhi. He's also a titanic figure, and is a major figure in world history and in our part of the world. And people don't know in Pakistan that when a Muslim wrote a biography of the Holy Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, he asked Gandhi to write the foreword. Just think of it. And that every time Gandhi chanted his Hindu prayers, he would equate Brahma and Allah and elevate both, so that basically we're all praying to our own notion of God, and we must respect each other. He would start his morning prayers with the Quran, reading from the Quran, the Bible. So these are great, I think, facts that we don't know. And above all, that Quaid-e-Azam had immense respect for him. And when Gandhi died, Quaid-e-Azam's statement mentioned 4 times, he used the word great about Gandhi. And he said, the Muslims have lost their greatest friend in India. And then he said, he's a great man, 4 times. So if Quaid-e-Azam had so much faith, knowing that he was a political colleague, but also in a sense a rival, I think we have to reassess the role of a man like Gandhi, who wanted to promote this genuine dialogue and understanding, because this communal disharmony, Raza, is going to, I fear, and as you know, I've written a play on this, I fear lead us into a very dangerous phase of this confrontation, because the hatred that comes out, I see it in the media in India, it's so virulent and so irrational almost. Everything is blamed on the Muslims or on the Mughals. The Mughals are dragged into everything and they're blamed for everything that happens in India. And that's why it's critical that both sides bring down the temperature, cool the temperature, and try to begin to talk to each other as, if not as friends, at least as intelligent colleagues, and not indulge in this kind of emotional hatred, almost like children. If they lose a cricket match, somehow ISI is involved in this conspiracy there. In Pakistan, it's the same thing. Anything that happens, as you know, whether it's in Balochistan or it's Indians are involved. So we have to grow up a little bit, understanding that looming over all this is the threat of nuclear war, which is very, very dangerous for both sides. No one can afford it. And if you have a couple of million killed on this side or that side, which Pakistani or which Indian will be prepared to say, we don't mind, so many million Muslims will die or so many million Hindus will die? Neither Quaid-e-Azam nor Gandhi would accept this. So we have to begin to think in terms of a common humanity and rise above our own petty interpretation of each other.
That's a great message and a great ending to our once again enlightening episode. Dr. Ahmed, once again, thank you. And viewers, please leave your comments and your questions and give us your feedback. And with that, we shall return with another episode of this series on the global state of Muslims in 21st century. Goodbye.
Thank you.